hello again. Welcome into 101.7 FM and 710 KEEL. Welcome into another edition of Strategies for a Living. I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan. You are Rapid Ruben Wright, ace of the airwaves.
Correct. Good evening, everybody.
How you doing?
I am doing excellent this evening.
Do you realize we've almost made it through the week?
Almost.
Sans Carla?
Right. Yeah.
We've missed her,
just
though.
about.
I've missed her. I don't know about
totally.
you.
Yeah. I've definitely missed Carla for sure. But I'm glad she's playing grandma to two babies.
Yeah,
that just blows my mind.
Count them. We'll learn all about that. I think she'll be back with us on Monday, so we'll learn all about that.
That's great.
You were raised up in the country, right?
I think, yeah, I'm from Minden, and a lot of my family resides in Dubberly, and I raised pigs for 4-H, and did some hunting and fishing and
kind of
things
a
of that sort.
heartland of your own, if
A little
you
bit,
will.
yeah.
Yeah, we're going to talk about a fifth generation Kansas farmer. Our life strategist is Sarah Smarsh. She says she was born to that. Roots so deep in the country where she was raised that she rode tractors on the same land that her ancestors rode wagons. I don't know if you and I could say that.
No.
So, but Sarah Smarsh is our life strategist today. Her memoir is a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth, and I know you and I can relate to that.
Yeah, working in radio, definitely.
Exactly. Folks, thank you for tuning in to Strategies for Living this evening. We are presented by CADA, the Council on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse of Northwest Louisiana. Been helping individuals and families now for 60 years. We're also brought to you by Jerry Anderson, State Farm Insurance, by Learning RX, by Highland Place Rehab and Nursing Center, by Jacob's Well, Inspirational Books and Gifts, and by Resilient House. Back in a moment to meet our life strategist, the author of Heartland, Sarah Smarsh.
I met you, my country girl. You didn't have a thing. I fell in love.
If we're talking
Staring up the road and pray to God I see headlights.
Welcome back. Welcome back into 101.7 FM and 710 KEEL. Welcome back into Strategies for Living. I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan. Let's welcome to the program now Sarah Smarsh, whose widely circulated pieces on class and the working poor have been published by Harper's, NewYorker.com, the New York Times, the Creative Nonfiction, and many others, with recent essays in The Cut on the activism of low-income women in red states, and The Guardian. She has an MFA in nonfiction writing from Columbia University. Recently was a fellow at Harvard University's Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. Heartland is her very first book, and so we welcome Sarah Smarsh as our life strategist this evening. Miss Smarsh, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, David.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for being here. So this is a memoir, and it goes back 4 generations of your Kansas family, reaches back to a great-grandmother working multiple jobs, beaten by her husband. But you address the book to a future generation, right?
That's right. So even though the book Heartland is called a memoir, that might not completely encapsulate the framing of the story, which, as you say, is really a family tale and a deeply generational one. So I was raised on a wheat and cattle farm west of Wichita, 5th-generation Kansas farm kid by way of my paternal side. My mother's side of the family, it's a little bit different lot. They're not so much rural, but definitely poor. A lot of single mothers raising daughters, as it happened when I was a kid and in previous generations. And so the legacy I inherited on their side of the family had to do with teen pregnancy. So this book is actually addressed very intimately to that kind of imagined entity of would-be child that I might have had as a teenager in pregnancy.
Your unborn daughter, August, right?
Yeah, I think that term might not quite get it done, and that it suggests that there is a conceived child. So I like to say would-be child or would-be daughter. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you're the daughter of a teenage mother who is the daughter of a teenage mother.
That's right. Going back as far as I can find as long as records are kept, I'm the first woman in my direct maternal line to not have a baby as a teenager.
Yeah. So August is this theoretical child born during your teenage years.
That's right.
Whose very existence would have continued this line of motherhood. And so it's a guiding principle. What would you tell your daughter to do? But it's also a symbol, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Symbol of poverty.
Yeah, I think so. There was a time not so long ago in human history when every class of female had babies very young, but today and certainly over the course of the 20th century, it definitely correlates with poverty, statistically speaking, at least. And I knew growing up in a poor place that motherhood makes poverty harder, and poverty makes motherhood harder, and that kind of cycle going round and round can be very difficult to break.
Now, I think I know, Sarah, that you worked on this book a long, long time.
That's right.
What, over 10 years? How long did you work? How long did it take you to write this book?
I got my first research grants in 2002 when I was a senior at the University of Kansas. That's when I started piecing together the family tale, and it took a long time to put the whole book together for various reasons, one of which was that I was still living in poverty most of the time. I was trying to tend to the work, and when you've got to fight to survive and pay the bills in the meantime, it kind of slows down a creative project. But yeah, it wasn't at all contrived for this political moment that it is a timely publication in. I started it 16 years ago. Wow.
Do you remember the moment that it came together for you, that it kind of downloaded to you, that you said, I gotta put this together? Do you remember that moment?
You know, that's an interesting question because for me, believe it or not, I even as a child knew that I was going to write this book, and I would say to my family, I'm going to write a book about you someday. Now, of course, I had no idea at that time what it might look like or why it might be relevant or the ways in which the story would become, you know, a springboard to talking about bigger national issues. You know, I've made very strategic decisions along the way for it to come into being, and so I can't tell you a specific moment. It's just kind of always in my creative aura, if you will.
Yeah, and it evolved. Was this your thesis? Was it a part of your thesis for your
It was,
MFA?
yes. So I got those first research grants when I was an undergraduate at the University of Kansas. Not too long after that, as a young journalist, I got a Master's of Fine Arts in Nonfiction Writing, kind of integrating my journalism training with my more artistic writer self at Columbia University. And while I was there, it was my master's thesis. And for your listeners, if they get a hold of Heartland, I would say a good half of the words are just about verbatim as they were written well over a decade ago around that time. So
one of the main characters in the book is Grandma Betty, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Tell us a little bit about Grandma Betty. What do we need to know?
So she's my maternal grandmother, and really, because of that teen pregnancy cycle we were talking about, was in many ways a second mother to me. That's a pretty common feature of poor households where they're basically children having children. She was all of 34 years old when she became a grandma to me, and so.
Is she the one you told you're going to write a story about her one day?
She is, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and so she, you know, my paternal grandparents also played a large role in my upbringing, but it was Betty with whom, and her farmer husband, with whom I moved in permanently when I was 11 years old. And you know, she just had, I understood as a kid, even in the context of a kind of crazy world, poverty can be a very chaotic kind of life, and even in that space, her life was particularly extreme. You know, she was born in 1945 to a really violent father and that great grandmother of mine you mentioned earlier, who worked on the factory floors here in Wichita, building airplanes, and so she survived a very harrowing upbringing. She had polio as a kid, which she had such a hard life that's just like a minor detail in her list of problems. And she was one of the few to survive without paralysis. When she was 16, she became pregnant with my mom. The father was a severely physically abusive, essentially professional criminal. And so she really, for the course of the 1960s and into the 70s, spent a lot of years just with a lot of hard knocks, really traversing the Midwest, waiting tables in truck stop diners, working in factories, you know, barely enough to get enough food in her belly and her children's. But all the while, you know, she's like a sassy, tough, take no BS, salty Midwestern dame. And so while it might sound like a pitiful tale, she is a quite triumphant character in every way. And I admired her so much as a kid for her humor and dignity. And so she, to me, is really at the heart of the story of the book.
Do you think she believed you when you told her, I'm going to write a book about you one day?
You know, it blows my mind, and my grandma is someone who would shoot you straight on this, so I do believe her. I asked her that once, and she told me, yes, I believed you, and I have no idea how or why, because there is no more improbable claim a ragamuffin kid like myself could make in our place where people didn't go to college, let alone get books published.
Yeah, and you didn't come from a bookish family, did you? I mean...
No, not at all. And Betty, you know, she has very generously shared her stories with me over the years to tell this book with her blessing, but even she is sort of like, books, not my thing.
Yeah.
It's just not our culture, not for lack of intellect, but it wasn't a bookish people. My mother was the exception to that rule, and so I'm sure that had a hand in shaping my interests. But yeah, it's I might as well be from Mars, the fact that I'm an author and a journalist in my family.
Who are the other family members that we probably need to know about Sarah, besides
So,
Grandma Betty?
Sure. So I mentioned her parents. That, as you said, goes back 4 generations. And she had a daughter, Jeannie, who's my mother. I mentioned she was a bookish kid, and in some ways just really had the heart and mind of an intellect, and even an intellectual, maybe even a poet. And my father, Nick, who was born into a German Catholic rural Kansas wheat farming community, a very stoic kind of culture, but he's also kind of a poetic and very gentle man. Lucky for me, because as we've been discussing, that wasn't often the case for children in my family to be so fortunate as to have a kind father.
Right.
And so Jeannie and Nick are my parents, and their stories are definitely central to the book.
So we're going to take a break here, and when we come back, I want to dive a little deeper into the family. And we'll talk about this memoir of yours of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth, because there's a story behind the story. Heartland, Sarah Smarsh, our life strategist today. We'll be back.
One time in my life, I felt as long.
Welcome back into 101.7 FM, 710 KEEL, Welcome back into this edition of Strategies for Living. I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan, joined by the author of Heartland, Sarah Smarsh. What's that sound like when you hear that, Sarah? The author.
It sounds pretty good.
Doesn't it sound
all
good?
right.
Because this is the first one, right? First one of.
Yeah, that's right.
First
yes.
one, I'm sure, of many too.
We'll see.
So, Heartland is at your favorite bookseller right now, and it's been years in the making. You said 15 years?
That's right.
In the making. Wow. So it's got to feel good to walk into the. What was it like to walk into the bookstore for the first time and see your book there?
I'm not going to lie. It's pretty exciting. It's still exciting. I've
Yeah.
been fortunate to be on a book tour, and every time I see it somewhere in public, I think, I made that thing. And
I love
of course,
it.
a lot of hands go into getting it out into the world. But
Sure.
for something to be such a private, creative process for so long, and then have it be out in the world and people talking to me about it, it's a writer's dream come true.
So this is the story of a family. It's the story of your family, generations back. We're talking Grandma Betty and Nick and Jeannie, but it's the story behind it. It's also the prejudices, the stereotypes, the lack of awareness about class, and I want to talk about all of that with you today. Before we leave the family, we'll come back. But before we leave this segment on the family, was there a family member that was real hard to write about, or harder to write about than others, Sarah?
What an interesting question. Regardless of who I'm writing about, whether I'm deeply close to them or not, I always try to do right by a person in terms of, something like that involves memory and perspective is subjective ultimately, but there's also hard facts in the world, and I feel like it is a very serious responsibility to handle someone's life story in a book, and so I guess for that reason I don't think anyone struck me as any harder than any other to write about. Some people, of course, get more time in the spotlight, and that meant more digging around to figure out their story. But, as far as at a more personal level that I think you're getting at, I took every turning of a person into a character with equal gravity.
Because the story behind the story here, really is the stereotypes, the prejudices that people that we have against the poor. And who of us, can say, no, I don't have that, or I've never had that, or that's not, I don't know. You stretch us. You make us think here, Sarah. So, I applaud you for that.
Thank you.
So is that one of the reasons that it took so many years?
I think it is. David, when I was a kid, sensing I was going to write the book, like I said earlier, I didn't understand why it might matter, and it really, the irony of having to work to pay the bills and the process of the book stretching out is that in that time I gained, as a journalist, and also as a grant writer for some time in the nonprofit sector for social service causes, I gained a language to articulate exactly what you're getting at right now, which is, here's the trouble on my family, and it is has been an aspect of American culture and truly global since day one, and this country has sort of turned a blind eye to this particular aspect of inequality in our social structure, and when you don't have the words to name something, as a therapist, that can be the hell of it, is if it's just sort of this amorphous tension or struggle, and so finding the words to name the shame and the pain that my family certainly wasn't walking around talking about was really part of the long journey, for sure.
Yeah, you talk pretty early in the book about our lack of awareness about class. You're right, the defining feeling of my childhood was that of being told there wasn't a problem when I knew damn well there was. Yeah. how does this understanding or the lack of the understanding, how does it rise to the surface?
Mm. Well, we seem to be at a moment in our country or our society where it is rising to the surface somehow. It seems to be a kind of moment of reckoning for the country about class. That has some things to do with politics, but I think more than anything, it is that we're at a moment of historic wealth inequality. And when you have so many people working so hard and yet struggling for all their best efforts and intentions, even a country that's been telling itself that class structure isn't so much a thing here, we've got a meritocracy going on, and we talk about the American dream, which is a lovely idea. So many people at this point are not seeing that play out in their lives that I think that is requiring or opening us up to, kind of cracking us open to examining what's really going on.
Who told you there wasn't a problem?
Well, I'm definitely from a culture where it's sort of like, well, let me start by saying I never in a million years thought that we were poor. And there's kind of a blessing in that, I suppose. But it was like I had enough to eat and a roof over my head, and so it's sort of like no complaints, and that's how I was raised, and I think there's some power in that. But if you're going so far as to sort of deny or not acknowledge the extent to which you are being, I hesitate to use the word victimized because my family never would have seen themselves that way. But if you're on the losing end of a bunch of big forces that you as an individual or family can't possibly contend with, that is such a painful truth that it can require a sort of denial just to get up every day and keep going.
Yeah, and we're in a country, of course, the United States. Our very founding is on a foundation of equality and meritocracy, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it would suggest just the way that we use language. I talk in the book about how when you just get down and look at the words that we use. So we've got this meritocracy thing going. We say, as you point out, where in theory your outcomes somehow match your effort or your talent or your skills, and that's not what I see in my family, where I come from a whole bunch of real smart, real talented, hardworking people, and they largely have had very harsh, negative economic outcomes in their lives. But to go back to the word choice, when we say in our culture, poor people, okay, we understand that to mean lacking in financial resources.
Right.
That's the very same word that we use to describe something that is just bad. So a poor test results, poor health, etc. The same word that we use to describe the people I come from in economic terms is literally a synonym for bad or negative.
That is an interesting concept right there. And we don't you're stretching us here, Sarah. We don't think enough about that. That's a very interesting idea. I don't think I've ever heard anybody else say that or point that out.
Well, that's high praise. Thanks, and it's for a bad reason that I need to point it out, I suppose. But yeah, we've got to. I, as a writer, think a lot about the power of words and language, and you can find a lot about your culture just in the things that you, as you point out, mindlessly say. So it's not as though anyone's walking around with, necessarily conscious malice toward poor folks when they use that word, but it's just entrenched in the culture. Yeah,
I mean, there's a writer I've interviewed before. One of his agreements, the author of the 4 Agreements, Don Miguel Ruiz. One of his agreements is be impeccable with your words. With your word is one of his 4 agreements, and he includes how the words of course, the words we say to each other, but also the words we say to ourselves. And I think we have a conscious, we have an unconscious. Individually, I think we have it collectively too.
I 100% agree with that, and it does seem, that this conversation is coming into consciousness for us collectively now. There is some sort of zeitgeist going on where the world is open to a story like mine, where I could throw into the discussion about how this book took so long that I spent 10 years trying to get an agent, and nobody understood why this story might matter to the culture.
Right.
So that, it's I'm with you that there's some kind of collective shift happening, and that's very heartening to me, because the reason I ever became a writer and a journalist is it really rubs me wrong when I can feel kind of a gulf between what's really going on and what people are saying.
So you think we're beginning to reckon with this a bit, Sarah? I mean,
I do, and the way that I know is that I'm talking with you right now, and there are people listening, hopefully, and with concern about the issue. So I do think that something is shifting. Now we've got a long way to go to start solving the problems, but first you got to name the problem, and I think that's where we're at.
Yeah. Your family, you guys thought you were middle class, huh?
Yeah, I don't. It's not as though anyone was walking around using that word, but that
Right.
that was my sense of ourselves. And I think
you're looking back. You look back, and with hindsight, you can see clearly. Well, we grew up in poverty.
Oh yeah, by every measure. Yes. Now, poverty in itself is kind of relative, and within that experience, there's all sorts of strata. Like there's poor, and then there's poor, and then there's
who did
poor.
Who did you consider? I mean, if you thought you were middle class growing up, who did your family consider to be the poor?
Honestly, to me, it was as basic as the litmus test was truly just rote survival. So if you had enough to eat and just a protection from the elements, to me, I thought. Now, I should point out, I went to school in a small town, and the back to the relativity of class. Somebody who's from like a prep school in New England probably would have looked at my whole town as quote unquote poor. I've experienced some of my friends as being, I wouldn't go so far as to say wealthy, but like if a girl's dad was the postmaster on Main Street and her mom went to the mall every weekend in Wichita, I thought that was really high on the hog. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So for me, but yeah, as you were getting at, I did not think of myself as poor. I just thought, I thought my family worked hard, but we had enough to survive, and my just rudimentary understanding of class and the concept of poverty was that we must not have nothing to complain about.
Yeah, and you're touching, I think, on one of the things that makes any discussion of class pretty difficult. It's hard to define. It's hard to wrap our minds around it, isn't it? It's
totally.
It's layered. And so and then there's layers of denial to it.
Yeah, and I think that some of those layers of denial are kind of essential to keeping things humming the way that they are. And one of the real privileges of my life and my vantage and my ability to analyze all of this business is that I've now got the time and the health and the mental wherewithal, to do so, as opposed to it's not so long ago. And I remember what the life feels like when every morning you get up and you're bone tired from the second job that you worked last night, and I'm, as a journalist, I'm in a class that involves, sitting around on Twitter all day and pondering ideas.
Yeah.
This is when the time or space or formal education to do such a thing in a life that I come from, and that really, I think, plays a role in keeping people down, because when you're just fighting to get by every day, there isn't even a moment to stop and look around and catch your breath and maybe organize with your buddy, like, hey, we've got a real grievance here.
Yeah. We're talking with Sarah Smarsh, our life strategist here on Strategies for Living today. She's the author of Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth. We'll be back.
After midnight, out in the moonlight.
bright lights, big city. It's gone to my baby's head.
And welcome back. Welcome back into Strategies for Living here on 101.7 FM, 710 KEEL. Marriage and family therapist David McMillan with Sarah Smarsh this evening. She is the author of Heartland. It's a memoir of working hard, being broke in the richest country on earth. Very, very good read. You can find it wherever you buy books. It's eye-opening. It's gonna stretch you. Gonna make you think, and that's what we like our life strategists to do, Sarah. So you're doing a good job.
Thanks.
So let me, I wonder today, is there any change today because you grew up before the digital age, right?
That's right. Just
yeah.
kind of the last moment before that cultural shift. I was a child in the 80s and a teenager in the 90s. Now, by the 90s, middle-class houses were getting computers and dialing into the internet. But
so has that changed?
Not my.
Is that a change at all for a country girl today versus you as a country girl back in the 80s and 90s?
You know, I think it must be, and I hope that someone is studying such things as we speak. It's kind of a frontier in some ways to explore what it means to us as a society, and specifically the rural society you're talking about, kind of later to get in on the digital moment. This thing we have called the digital divide still certainly affects rural Americans that have a harder time getting online just for their geographic isolation from that infrastructure. But by and large nowadays, you know, farmers have smartphones on their tractors, and kids certainly at the very least are highly plugged into our internet moment when they go to their public schools, even in a country area, and I think that must play a big role in just heightening awareness of your identity maybe as a rural kid. When I was, I mentioned that I didn't realize that we were poor. I also didn't realize that there was something so increasingly rare about my experience as a farm kid in this country. So yeah, that's a rare experience in a national sense. But even here in Kansas, the stereotype of a state like mine is that we're all farmers. And in fact, I'm in the major minority for having grown up on a farm. And yes, an agricultural state, but one where industrialized and consolidated agriculture has been putting little family farms like ours under for decades. And so, but this is a long way of saying that when I was a kid, I didn't know all that. And one of the reasons is my childhood without cable TV or internet looked more like a 1950s upbringing than a 2018 upbringing in some ways. And I think, if I were plugged in those ways now, I'd probably have a keener sense of like, oh, I'm rural, whereas this is increasingly a country where most people are urban, or I'm poor in this sort of pecking order. And in some ways, I'm kind of glad I didn't know it.
Yeah. Country isn't just a place. It's tied to an image, huh? Mm-hmm. Pro-gun, pro-life, maybe big beards. I don't know.
Right.
How did we develop this country as an image? How did that develop?
This is another shift I think that has happened just in the few decades of my lifetime. So, I write in the book about how there wasn't anything about our version of the country that involved what I might suggest as sort of a performance sometimes. So once people know, okay, if I'm country, then that means I should be wearing boots and listening to this particular radio station and so on. For us, country was a place, it was work, it was a life. But, my mom preferred to wear high heels and dresses from some clearance rack, and my dad didn't like country music. And while, a lot of pickup trucks, and then I listen to country music these days, that there are those cultural touchstones. However, they were not such a commodified identity. I feel like in particular, and you mentioned pro-life and gun rights and such, there has been a real, maybe kind of artful leveraging of those cultural touchstones by conservative forces in the last few decades to sort of claim that space politically. Mm-hmm. It was a much more politically diverse place when I was coming up than the national media narratives today would have folks believe. So I think the idea that a particular music genre or a particular trade or geographic location somehow is equates with a particular political ideology is a fairly recent idea in our country, and I wasn't aware of that as a kid.
Yeah. What do you think about people adapting the image now? The Joanna Gaines, HGTV,
Right.
we farmhouse chic.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you think? What does that make you think of when you see that?
Well, to be honest, initially I just kind of get a kick out of it, and usually I think like, well, if they really want to live on a farm, I can tell you that it's not going to be so beautiful and sentimental in those moments that they're pouring tea at the picnic table on a fixer upper. Just not to say that they don't work hard or that isn't a real farm, but this sort of presentation of that lifestyle as a style and as for some people, frankly, an affectation is, I think it's what in other areas of our culture we would call cultural appropriation. And I'm not, personally insulted by it. I suppose it's a nice honor if someone thinks that way of life is desirable in a culture that largely has a negative attitude toward my place and people. But I do pause because I feel like sometimes maybe the same people who are, at Target or Pottery Barn buying something that's meant to look like it weathered decades in my family's barn.
Yeah, and spend maybe $40,000 doing it.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
And those same people, I suspect might also hold some condescending attitudes for the same folks who own that look by way of necessity. So it's complicated and a little troubling, I think.
What's the answer? Where do we begin? How do we begin to grapple with beyond? Obviously you're making us think here in Heartland. What's the beginning point of grappling with this, Sarah?
And by this, do you mean the rural, urban, or class, or all of it?
All of it, especially the class distinctions, especially the divide. Yeah.
Well, and again, I sort of hinted at this earlier, but as a writer, I look to the power of language, and that is where I can be of service. There are probably many facets to the ultimate solution. My piece of it has to do with story, and I think that when we live in a world where, because of wealth inequality, because formal higher education is harder to access, and places like newsrooms that set the stories about our country, and the college campuses that train the journalists that are going to end up there, and everyone that's that gets to be in the business of storytelling, when that space has a whole lot of blind spots, not for lack of good intentions on the part of the people working there, but if you've got a mostly upper class, mostly white, mostly urban, news center in New York City, then there's going to be blind spots about race, about
Yes.
class, about place. And so I, having seen the trajectory of my life transformed by education, I'm real big on we need to make sure that college campuses are accessible, and then people who have real ownership of these hard luck stories will have an opportunity to be heard in a direct way, because there's no accuracy like the person who has lived it herself, and her language for it might not be academic or expert in policy ways, but we've got to hear from people who live these things firsthand, not just the folks who are rightfully experts in the way of research, but that is a particular kind of expertise that can't always get the story right. So, I think, and the reason that this all matters to your question is that so long as we're telling ourselves the wrong stories, if we don't even understand what the problem is, then we can't begin to fix it. And I just want to hear. I want there to be more people from where I'm from who get to be heard. And I think that will make some progress.
The book is Heartland. Sarah Smarsh is the author and our life strategist this evening here on Strategies for Living. Be right back.
Diamonds I'd offer to you, a solid gold mansion, an airplane or two.
One, two, three, four, one. If you got the money, honey, I've got the time.
And welcome back. Welcome back into 1017 FM 710. You've had a good time tonight with all your you just reached in there, got Willie and everybody.
Yeah, I like my old country music. So yeah, this has been a real treat.
She don't you think Ruben did a good job, Sarah?
I do. I was honestly thinking they got the best music of any radio show I've been on.
I love it. I love it.
Well, I appreciate it.
Welcome back, folks. Welcome back into 1017 FM 710 KEEL. Welcome back into Strategies for Living. Rapid Ruben Wright. I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan with Sarah Smarsh. The book is Heartland. It's a memoir of working hard and being broke in this, the richest country on earth. You were mentioning the importance of education. What about particularly civics?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, that's a big one, yeah. And, I don't mean to suggest that, like, book learning, as my family would call it, is the only path.
Yeah.
Is the only path for anyone. But I do think that our public school system is the one moment we've got to get all our kids on the same page and say, here is how this country works. Here are your rights, and here, by the way, is some math and reading that you're going to need for the rest of your life. And absolutely a piece of that should be civics. It was my favorite class in 7th grade, and I believe it has really fallen by the wayside in curricula nationally. And so it's not much of a mystery to me as to, if people are tearing their hair out about how for lack of a better word, ignorant people are about
Yeah.
their own democratic process. It's no mystery how it came to that point.
Just a question, not one that I expect you to answer, but just a rhetorical question to throw out there. Whether we're talking about politicians on the left or politicians on the right, how many send their kids to public schools? How many
Oh, my
send their
goodness.
kids to private schools? Again, just something to think about, right, Sarah?
Absolutely, and
Yeah.
that's I'd love to see that number. A lot of times, the folks charged with protecting that system aren't relying on it themselves, and I reckon that's a problem.
Yeah. Good book. I hope we get a chance to talk again. Thank you for the work thank you for the hanging in there for the 15 years it took to write this book, and thank you for stretching us this evening, making us think.
Thank you.
Heartland, Sarah Smarsh, at your favorite bookseller right now. Folks, thank you for tuning in to Strategies for Living. We've been brought to you by CADA, the Council on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse of Northwest Louisiana, by Jerry Anderson State Farm Insurance, by Learning RX, by Highland Place Rehab and Nursing Center, by Jacob's Well Inspirational Books and Gifts, and by Resilient House. If today were the last day of your life, and you only had one more phone call that you could make, who is it that you would call? And what is it that you would say? And why are you waiting? Make the call. For Sarah Smarsh and for Reuben Wright, I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan. See you next time on Strategies for Living.
Breaking news and trending talk. This is 1017 FM and 710 KEEL. KEEL, Shreveport.
It's time. It's time. It's time. Friday Football Frenzy, powered by Chevyland, is on the air. Tim Fletcher and his cavalcade of correspondents guide you through all the games in the area. When the game gets tight, late in the fourth quarter, we take you there live. Coaches, kids, correspondents, and Fletch, all here for Friday Football Frenzy, powered by Chevyland. Feel the frenzy.